when you look at the moon images, and I've studied the moon, I mean, countless amount of hours. I've got so many moon images. There's a famous dome structure that I discovered that made it onto TV on 2 different shows because it's undeniable, a dome structure on the moon. Now, that came from the Apollo 11 video, so it wasn't an old Photoshopped image or anything anybody could touch up. It came directly from the archives from a downloaded video stream of the limb coming back to the command module. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the moon, those craters are never in any particular angle. In other words, if I'm free floating through space and I've got things coming at me, it would hit an angle and then make a track until it comes to a point where it stops, and then it would create a crater. All these things are straight down, perfectly straight down. There's nothing that slid and moved into a particular angle to create an implosion. It's all an explosion. It looks like all implosions, like what you're talking about. You have these craters that seem to be all almost the same depth. How is that even possible?
Yeah, that's crazy.
And so I went to usgs.gov and I downloaded some imagery there. I sent it to a friend of mine who runs Mars Anomalies. He's an expert on looking at these USGS.gov ground-penetrating images. These came from the Arecibo before it collapsed and broke, a few years ago.
From what?
The Arecibo satellite array that we had in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
It's no longer functioning, but we have images from it still. There was one of the largest satellites on Earth that were able to take radio images of planets and so forth. Well, we used it and pointed it at the moon. And guess what we found out? Underneath the surface of the moon, there appears to be some gigantic, what we can only assume might be metallic or beam-like structures 30 meters beneath the surface. So is it that they only stop there because that's as far as you can go? I mean, we don't know. But what's interesting is they all seem to almost have the same depth, and there doesn't seem to be much of a debris around the rim. Where did all that debris go? There's enough gravity to pull it back down, but it just seems to be gone. So what are those? Now, we have a black box audio, which I'll send to you so you can play this. In the black box audio from Apollo 11, one of the astronauts, I believe it was Neil, said, look at those convex domes down there, or convex craters, I believe he says. Now, convex, I believe he said convex.
Convex means it's like this.
Yes, which doesn't make any sense. Then he says, I bet the people down there never get out. And that's on the redacted, printed statement. They didn't redact that statement, and it's also in the audio. So that's made it into documentaries that I've done because I discovered that. So I'll send you a copy of that. You can play it in this podcast. But what's interesting is that's a pretty blunt statement to make, and knowing that it's being recorded, and then they actually let it stay in the documents and the audio, the black box audio from Apollo 11.
Can you find that on YouTube?
You might be able to.
Okay.
You might be able to. But I know I have the download link in my Anunnaki group.
Okay.
That I can get it. Yeah. It's pretty crazy.
That's very crazy, man.
And I think I have the link directly to the source on nasa.gov as well.
I just had a guy on my podcast about a month ago. He, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. His name's Chris Bledsoe. And he has these crazy experiences where he sees orbs all the time. Like he goes out into his backyard and he has these orbs that follow him, and he films them and he posts them on Instagram.
Wow.
And nobody knows what they are.
Wow. That's interesting.
It's really interesting. And he believes it's spiritual. He believes they're angels. And he's got this great book called UFO of God, where he talks about his like life story and how he started witnessing these orbs, and then he started seeing like this apparition of a lady. Anyways, he started getting attention from NASA, and one day a guy from this is all like documented and confirmed. Like he is like the most credible. The crazy thing about him is his story is so phenomenal, unbelievable. I mean, post these videos every day. He came down here. We went to the beach, and he summoned these fucking orbs from the beach. I watched this shit come out of the ocean.
Wow.
And it's on video.
Wow.
It's not just like hearsay. We literally filmed it.
That's incredible.
And the craziest thing about it is that there's all these people from NASA, CIA, and the Pentagon that started showing up at his house and talking to him and interviewing him. One guy, his name was Hal Povenmire, who showed up at his house one day and said, "Hey, is Chris Bledsoe home? I just wanted to hope to talk to him for a little bit." And his son answered the door and let the guy in. And he's like, "I just drove from Cape Canaveral, Florida." The guy, and he drove to I think they were in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Wow.
So he drove from Cape Canaveral, North Carolina, and sat there and interviewed him and his family for hours.
Wow.
And kept coming back over like a couple times a year to ask him questions, and he was trying to confirm if the guy's story was full of shit or not. Started interviewing people around him, family members, friends, other people who claimed to be witnesses of his event. And long story short, this guy becomes like close friends to the family. And this guy, Hal, turns out he was the guy who was in charge of mapping the moon for the Apollo missions. And I guess one day they were having dinner, and he asked him, he's like, Hal, he's like, is what they say about the moon true? What's the craziest thing that you could tell me about the moon? And he's like, he asked him about like the dark side of the moon. Like, is there stuff on the dark side of the moon? And he goes, there are structures that are ancient on the dark side of the moon. And that's all we know about them. He's like, there's structures there and they're ancient. He didn't tell him anything more than that. And they're shaped like mushrooms.
Wow. Well, I downloaded a lot of images from the Clementine mission. So I was looking into the moon, and I discovered a prior top secret mission called Clementine. And I said, I wonder if there's any images on this. And they had been declassified, so I got the images from nasa.gov. Now, what's interesting about these Clementine images, when I saw the name Clementine mission, I already knew right away what was going to happen. This thing never came back. Remember that song, Oh, My Darling Clementine, You Were Lost and Gone Forever? I already put 2 and 2 together. And sure enough, by the time I got done with the end of this document, this thing had supposedly hit something on the far side of the moon, and it never returned, but it transmitted all this data, gigabytes of data of images, crazy images. So this Clementine was a low lunar orbiting mission that went to the far side of the moon and documented that there are structures on that side. If you remember during one of the Apollo missions, when the astronauts were orbiting the moon and they got to the far side, you were out of radio communication range. But all of a sudden, somebody hacked into their comms from that side, and it sounded like music. It sounded like people chanting in their ears, and they were all freaking out. It's on the black box.
Right.
What, you hear this? You hear this? What is it? What is that? And it filled up the whole capsule until they got back in the communications range again. Then they got reconnected to Houston. So there's something going on that far side of the moon.
It's very freaky.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating thing to dive into, but it's like
the guy with the orbs is incredible.
His story's insane.
Because there's somebody in my document, my Black Knight satellite documentary.
Yes.
And he talks about the orbs. And he says that he was able to write some type of a code and frequency that was able to hack into some of them, that they're controlled, he calls them technology, and says they're like advanced probes from another civilization, and that they're watching us utilizing these orbs. That's what he claims.
Yeah.